The revolver hit the floor. 3 feet. That was all it fell. 3 feet onto bare wooden boards in a smoky saloon, and it fired. Nobody was aiming it. Nobody had cocked it. Nobody wanted it to go off. It just did. Because that was the reality of carrying a loaded firearm in the American West. It was not a symbol of power and confidence. It was a loaded, unpredictable machine strapped to the body of a man trying very hard not to get killed, sometimes by his own weapon. And if that moment of silence, that cold realization, intrigues you, welcome. You are in the right place. This is Mystery Wild West, where we strip away the Hollywood version and sit with the real thing. If you appreciate history told the way it actually was, uncomfortable, uncertain, and true, make sure you are subscribed. There is a lot more where this is coming from. Now, let us talk about guns in the Wild West, not the fantasy, the reality. Because there is almost nothing about the way men actually handled firearms on the frontier that matches what most people believe. The stances were different. The weapons were different. The techniques were different. The dangers were different. And the outcomes were almost always messier, more chaotic, and more humbling than the clean, elegant duels you have seen on any screen. What we are going to do today is walk through that reality from the ground up. We are going to talk about the weapons themselves, the way they were carried, the way they were drawn, the way they were fired, and the conditions under which all of that happened. And by the end, you will understand something that almost no Western film has ever bothered to show you. That surviving a gunfight in the real American West had less to do with speed and skill than it did with preparation, patience, and a great deal of luck. Let us start there. Imagine a man preparing to leave a town where he knows trouble is waiting. He knows it. He has been told as much. He has seen the faces at the bar, heard the low conversations that stop when he enters the room. He knows that before the sun sets again, there is a very real chance someone is going to try to hurt him or kill him. What does he reach for? If you are picturing him checking the cylinder of a revolver, adjusting a low-slung holster on his thigh, practicing a fast draw, you are imagining a film. A well-made film, perhaps. But a film. What that man actually reaches for is a long gun, a rifle, a shotgun, a lever-action repeater, or a double-barreled 10-gauge loaded with buckshot. Something with length, something with weight, something with power. Because a man who expects trouble and has any time at all to prepare for it does not walk toward that trouble with only a hip pistol. He walks toward it with the most effective tool available to him. The revolver, the famous Colt Single Action Army, the Smith & Wesson top break, whatever he happened to carry on his belt, that was a last resort. Not a primary weapon, not a weapon of choice, a weapon of desperation, a weapon for the moment when the rifle is not in your hands and the situation has already collapsed into something fast and close and dangerous. This is the single most important correction to make before anything else. The revolver was a backup. Professional men, men who understood violence and lived around it, men whose names later became famous for their skill with firearms, stated this plainly and consistently. They preferred long guns. They carried long guns when they expected a fight. The hip pistol was insurance, not strategy. Hollywood chose the revolver because a revolver is cinematic. You can show a hand hovering over a holster. You can show a fast draw. You can show a close-up of a man's eyes, then his hand, then a blur of motion. You can make it beautiful. A man walking into a confrontation with a double-barreled shotgun is not beautiful. It is efficient. It is practical. It is exactly what a man who intends to survive would carry. but it does not photograph with the same drama. So the shotgun disappeared from the myth, and the revolver became the icon of the West. And we have been telling that story wrong ever since. The shotgun had real reasons behind its dominance. Those reasons start with the body. When a man faces a genuine threat to his life, his body does not stay calm and analytical. It floods with chemicals designed to move him, to tighten him, to make him fast and reactive. His heartbeat accelerates. His hands develop a fine tremor. His breathing shortens. His vision narrows. He focuses on the threat, the face, the movement, the danger, and the small mechanical details of a firearm become much harder to manage. Under those conditions, a revolver with its small fixed sights and its need for precise aim becomes genuinely difficult to use effectively. The sights are small. They require careful alignment between a rear notch, a front post, and the target. Under stress, with shaking hands and narrowed vision, that alignment is hard to achieve and hard to hold. A shotgun loaded with buckshot does not require that precision. The shot spreads as it travels. At the distances where most confrontations happened, inside a building, across a room, down a short alley, the spread of buckshot was wide enough to compensate for trembling hands, rushed motion, and compromised aim. You did not need to thread the needle. You needed to point in the right direction and commit. That is an enormous practical advantage when your hands are shaking and the other man is moving. Add to that the stopping power. A load of buckshot striking a man delivers a blow that a single pistol round often cannot match. Stories from the frontier document men who took revolver shots and kept moving, kept fighting, kept threatening. The same is far less true for men who took a full charge of buckshot at close range. The shotgun ended problems in ways that a hip pistol often could not. For farmers, ranchers, townspeople, men who were not professional fighters but who might face violence on any given morning, the shotgun was even more obviously the correct choice. It was easier to use under stress. It was more reliable in its effect. It required less ongoing practice to remain effective with, and it was a common tool, familiar in a way that a pistol worn on the hip was not to most working men. The miners who guarded payroll shipments carried shotguns. The lawmen who faced down organized groups of armed men brought shotguns. The ranchers who protected their property in the night reached for the long gun leaning against the wall, not the pistol in the drawer. The revolver was always there, always available, always a fallback. But it was not the weapon that serious men chose when they had any say in the matter. Now we need to talk about how men actually carried and drew those revolvers, because this is where the gap between the myth and the reality becomes almost comical. That low-slung holster tied to the thigh, the so-called fast draw rig with the holster hanging well below the hip, often secured with a leather cord around the leg. That visual has appeared in countless films, countless novels, countless illustrations. It is perhaps the single most recognizable piece of the Hollywood gunfighter image. It was invented in the 1950s by costume designers, not in the 1870s, not on the frontier, not by lawmen or outlaws or anyone who ever needed to actually draw a revolver in a hurry. In the 1950s, by people designing outfits for actors to wear in front of cameras. Men on the actual frontier carried their revolvers high. The holster sat at the hip or even above it, positioned at the natural resting height of a hand hanging at the side. This was not an oversight. It was deliberate and practical. A high holster is stable on horseback. It does not swing or bounce during a gallop. It does not work loose over the hours of a long ride. It does not catch on the saddle or bruise the leg against the horse's flank. A man who spends 10, 12, 14 hours a day on the back of an animal needs his gear to stay put. A high holster is accessible. When your hand is resting at your side, it is already near a hip holster. You do not need to reach down or across or adjust your posture. The draw is a short, direct movement. A low-slung thigh holster requires reaching down and slightly across the body. It requires a longer draw stroke. It requires more movement, which takes more time, which is the opposite of what the designers claimed it was meant to achieve. The low holster looks fast on camera because of camera angles. The shot can show both the actor's hand and the holster simultaneously. It creates a visual line the eye can follow easily. It photographs well. That is its only advantage. On a real working horse, in a real working day, it was a liability, which is why actual frontiermen did not use it. There's another carrying preference that surprises people who are used to the film version. Many experienced men on the frontier carried their revolvers in what is called a cross draw. That means the holster was positioned on the opposite hip from the shooting hand, with the butt of the weapon facing forward rather than backward. To draw, the hand crossed the body, gripped the revolver from the front, and pulled it out. This sounds slower and more awkward than a same-side draw. And standing up, walking around, it often was. But seated on a horse, seated in a saddle for hours at a time, the cross-draw became faster and more natural than the same-side alternative. The body's position in the saddle, the angle of the hips, the height of the arm relative to the belt, all of these factors shifted the geometry in ways that made reaching across the body feel instinctive. A man who spent most of his working life mounted on a horse thought about the draw from a saddle, not from a standing position on a dusty street. That is where he would actually need to use the weapon, riding, pursued, turning in the saddle, trying to manage a frightened horse and a loaded revolver simultaneously. The cross draw fit that reality better than the same side hip draw that looks natural in a movie, and it is a small reminder that nearly every real practice of the era was shaped by horses, by the hours spent on them, by the demands of managing them, by the fact that a man's relationship with his horse was the most important practical relationship in his working life. Once the weapon was drawn, how did a man actually shoot it? This is where the story gets interesting in ways most people do not expect. The standard technique for pistol shooting through most of the 19th century was one-handed. One hand on the weapon, the other hand kept clear. The shooting arm was extended forward, often fully extended or close to it, with the body turned to present a narrower profile to the threat. This was not stubbornness or tradition for its own sake. There were real, mechanical reasons behind it, and understanding those reasons changes how you see almost everything about frontier gunfighting. The revolvers of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the guns actually used on the frontier, had a design feature that made two-handed shooting genuinely dangerous. Between the front face of the cylinder and the rear end of the barrel, there was a small gap. This gap existed because the cylinder rotates. It has to clear the barrel to turn, and that clearance space was simply part of how the mechanism worked. Every time the weapon fired, gas escaped from that gap. Not a little gas, a jet of superheated high-pressure gas, carrying burning particles of powder, sometimes carrying small fragments of lead. This jet was forceful and extremely hot. If your supporting hand was gripping the weapon in the way a modern two-handed grip positions it, fingers wrapping under or around the cylinder area, that hand was directly in the path of that gas jet. The documented injuries in period military and law enforcement records include severe burns to the fingers, partial amputations, and in some cases damage significant enough to end a man's ability to work. This was not a rare or unlucky event. It happened consistently whenever someone put their hand too close to that gap and fired, and military records show it happened often enough to be well documented and well understood. Keeping the supporting hand well clear of the weapon was not just tradition or cultural preference. It was the sensible response to a real, documented hazard. One hand on the weapon, the other hand kept safely away. The two-handed grip, the braced stances that modern shooters train with, these did not become standard practice in American law enforcement until the 1950s and 60s. By that point, modern revolvers had better sealed mechanisms and the danger had been reduced. But for the men of the frontier, shooting one-handed was both the cultural norm and the mechanically sound choice. There is something else about that one-handed stance worth understanding: the body position that accompanied it. When experienced men of the era prepared to fire, they did not face their opponent squarely. They turned their body sideways. The shooting shoulder was forward, the other shoulder pulled back, the body presenting its narrowest profile to the threat. This was directly inherited from dueling traditions. European dueling conventions, which had been practiced for generations before the American West existed, specified exactly this stance for exactly this reason. A human body viewed from the front is wide. A human body viewed from the side is roughly half as wide. In a situation where both men were armed and the contest was about who could hit whom first, reducing your profile was a meaningful advantage. Frontier men were not dueling in the formal European sense, but the logic was identical. If a man is trying to shoot you, giving him less to aim at increases your odds of walking away. The sideways stance accomplished that. You can sometimes see this in period photographs of lawmen and competitive shooters from the era. They stand in what looks like a stiff, stylized pose, angled, shooting arm extended, head turned to look along the arm at the target. It looks theatrical to modern eyes. But they were not posing for drama. They were demonstrating exactly what they would do in a real confrontation. Now, the sights. Here is something that will feel completely backwards if your understanding of shooting comes from modern training, from sport shooting, from any contemporary firearm instruction. Most experienced frontier gunfighters did not use their sights in close-quarters situations. At the distances where the vast majority of actual confrontations occurred, inside buildings, across rooms, in narrow corridors, at distances of 5 to 15 feet, trained shooters used a technique called point shooting, or instinctive shooting. They did not align the sights. They pointed the weapon the way you point a finger, using the body's natural directional sense to guide the barrel toward the target, and they fired. This sounds reckless. It sounds imprecise. But there are real reasons behind it, rooted in how the human body works under stress. Under genuine mortal danger, the visual system narrows. The threat becomes the focus. The brain locks on the thing that is dangerous, the man across the room, his hands, his movements, and detail attention shrinks. The small front sight post at the end of a gun barrel is not where your eyes naturally go in that moment. Your eyes go to the threat. Additionally, the sights on revolvers of that era were not easy to use quickly, even under calm conditions. They were small, fixed, and low contrast. Under stress, with a fine tremor in the hands and vision tunneled toward the man who is trying to kill you, acquiring those sights and holding the necessary alignment was not realistic for most people in most situations. What replaced formal sighted fire was a deeply practiced physical skill. The extended arm, the pointed weapon, the body's learned sense of direction, developed through repetitive dry practice. We will come to that in a moment, all combined to let experienced men put rounds onto targets at short range without consciously consulting their sights at all. This was not spraying bullets in a general direction and hoping. It was a practice skill with its own discipline and its own learning curve. But the discipline was different from the modern discipline of formal sight alignment. It was more physical, more instinctive, more like throwing a stone accurately than threading a needle. Professional men articulated their philosophy about this clearly in their recorded statements. The emphasis was on control, not speed. Do not rush. Take a moment. Make the shot matter. One accurate round to the center of a man's body was worth more, in every tactical sense, than 3 fast misses. The goal was not to be the first man to fire. The goal was to be the first man to actually connect. Think about what that tells us. These were not men chasing speed as an end in itself. They were men who understood, from hard experience or from the wisdom of others, that speed without accuracy was a liability. A fast shot that missed accomplished nothing except alerting the other man, obscuring your own vision with smoke, and leaving you exposed while your opponent was still entirely untouched. Speed had value only when it delivered accuracy. Accuracy without speed was still useful. Speed without accuracy was theater. Neeb, speaking of things that belonged in a theater rather than a real confrontation, let us talk about fanning. You have seen it in films so many times that it barely registers as something to question. A man holds the trigger of his revolver depressed and uses his free hand to repeatedly strike the hammer backward, cycling through the chambers in rapid succession. A blur of motion, a volley of shots in a fraction of a second, smoke and noise, and the dramatic image of a man unleashing his weapon with almost mechanical speed. Men who actually depended on revolvers for their survival considered this somewhere between embarrassing and suicidal. The mechanical problem is fundamental. Fanning a single-action revolver removes all practical control over the direction of the shots. The weapon is cycling faster than any deliberate aiming is possible. Each hammer strike introduces lateral movement into the gun itself. The barrel is moving, the cylinder is rotating. The shooter's own palm is pushing the weapon off whatever rough line it was on to begin with. At arm's length, fanning might hit a large target. Beyond that, and most confrontations in real life were not at arm's length, the documented accuracy of fanning approaches 0. You are producing noise, smoke, and spent cartridges. You are not consistently putting rounds where they need to go. The mechanical damage is also real. Fanning creates stresses in the revolver's timing mechanism, and hand, the small internal parts that synchronize cylinder rotation with hammer movement, that the weapon was not designed to absorb repeatedly. Guns fanned regularly showed accelerated wear and timing failures. A weapon that failed to time properly was a weapon that did not fire when the trigger was pulled, or worse, one that fired at an unexpected moment. Where did fanning come from if it was never a genuine combat technique? It came from show circuits. Wild West shows, touring entertainment productions that traveled the country in the latter half of the 19th century and the early 20th, needed spectacle. They needed things that looked dramatic, loud, and fast, because their audiences were there to be impressed, not to learn accurate history. Fanning looked spectacular. It sounded impressive. It worked perfectly as entertainment. From the show circuit, it moved into dime novels. From dime novels, it moved into early cinema. From cinema, it became the universal image of Western gunfighting, repeated so many times across so many stories that it started to feel like documented fact. It was not fact. It was theater that got mistaken for fact. A man who fanned his revolver at you in a real confrontation was either close enough that accuracy was irrelevant, extraordinarily lucky with his placement, or very shortly to discover that the man he was shooting at had taken his time, aimed, and connected with something solid. Similar things can be said about shooting from the hip. Hip shooting, firing the weapon without raising it above waist level, is everywhere in Western cinema. The fast draw ends with the gun still low, the shot fired from the hip before the weapon ever rises. It looks fast. It looks natural. It looks like exactly what a man in a hurry would do. Period sources acknowledge it exists. They describe it as occasionally useful at very close range, inside a room, within a few feet of the target, when raising the weapon would take too long. At those distances, a hip shot might connect even without real aiming, simply because the barrel is pointed somewhere close to the right direction and the target is right there. But those same sources are consistent in what they say about hip shooting at any practical distance. It does not work reliably. The physics are against it. A firearm held at hip level has only the wrist and forearm for support. There is no stability. The barrel is pointing wherever your wrist happens to be positioned, and under stress, with adrenaline moving through you, that position is inconsistent from moment to moment. A small variation in wrist angle at the point of firing becomes a large variation in where the bullet goes by the time it reaches a target 10 feet away, let alone 20. Raise the weapon to chest height, and the entire upper torso becomes the stabilizing structure. The arms have leverage against the body, the head can align over the weapon and provide rough sighting. The point of aim is vastly more consistent. Raise it further to chin or eye level, and you have the best possible stability the human body can provide for an extended arm pistol shot. The shot is slower to set up. The draw takes a moment longer, but the probability of actually hitting what you are pointing at increases dramatically. Professional men chose reliability. They chose the shot that was most likely to connect, not the shot that took the least time. Because a shot that missed was not just wasted, it was information given to the other man about where you were, delivered by a muzzle flash and a cloud of smoke while leaving him entirely unharmed. That is a bad trade, and men who had survived actual violence understood it was a bad trade. Pause here for a moment and think about what kind of person actually encountered violence in the American West. Not the mythological gunfighter with the perfect record and the lightning draw, the real person. Cowboys, ranch hands, miners, farmers, freight drivers, town marshals in small settlements, men who had learned to handle firearms the way they had learned to handle most tools, through occasional use, practical necessity, and the slow accumulation of experience over years. Most of these men were not professional fighters. Most of them had never been in a gunfight and hoped very much they never would be. Their firearms were tools for working life, for putting meat on the table, for dealing with predators threatening livestock, for the remote possibility of needing to defend themselves or their property from human threats. A working cowboy on a cattle drive in the 1870s earned roughly $1 per day, sometimes as little as $25 for an entire season's work. That was the economic reality. That was what the work paid. A box of 1,000 centerfire cartridges for a standard revolver caliber cost approximately $18 to $19 from a dry goods supplier. Take a moment with those numbers. If you are joining us for the first time, and this is the kind of careful history that interests you, stick around. This is what we do here. But let those numbers land first. 1,000 rounds cost between 18 and 19 days of wages. Not one day, not a week. Nearly 3 weeks of steady work bought you 1 box of ammunition, and that box would not last long if you were firing it regularly. Under those conditions, the idea of standing at a makeshift range and running through dozens of rounds to stay sharp, the way a modern shooter might train, was not something most frontier men could afford. It was financially equivalent to burning weeks of their wages for the pleasure of making noise. What men did instead was dry firing. They practiced with an empty weapon. They drew it, cocked it, aimed it, pressed the trigger over and over hundreds of times in the quiet of the evening or the early morning. They rehearsed the mechanics until the motions were automatic, until the draw was smooth and unhesitating, until the trigger press was clean and consistent. The mechanical skill of handling the weapon, cocking the hammer cleanly, indexing the cylinder correctly, managing the trigger, all of that could be learned and refined without spending a single round. And so, men practiced it constantly because that was what they could afford. What could not be learned from dry practice was the experience of live fire, the recoil, the noise, the smoke, the way the body responds to a real discharge, the way the sights move in the moment of firing, the arc of a slow, heavy lead bullet over distance, the experience of firing at something that moves unpredictably. And most critically, none of it could replicate the experience of firing at a person who is trying to do the same thing to you. This explains the miss rates in documented frontier gunfights, which are extraordinary even at close range. Men who had solid reputations for their skill with firearms, men who could draw cleanly and handle a weapon competently, missed their intended targets in actual confrontations at rates that seem almost impossible to explain through marksmanship alone. The explanation is that they had practiced the mechanics of shooting far more than the act of shooting. They were prepared in every way except the most important way, the experience of doing the real thing under real conditions when everything was moving and loud and the consequences were absolute. Live fire is what reveals the difference between knowing how to shoot and being able to shoot under pressure. And live fire was something most frontier men could rarely afford to practice. There is one more dimension to the economic reality that shapes the whole picture of frontier gunfighting, and it connects to something most modern people have never thought about at all. The firearms of the frontier were not loaded with the kind of propellant used in modern ammunition. Modern cartridges use smokeless powder, a clean burning propellant that produces very little visible smoke when it ignites. Every firearm on the frontier, every revolver, every rifle, every shotgun used black powder. Black powder burns dirty. When it ignites, it produces a large volume of thick, heavy smoke that is white to yellowish gray in color, acrid in smell, and slow to disperse. Not a thin wisp of smoke, not a subtle haze, a heavy cloud that hangs in the air. For a single shot fired outdoors on a calm day, the smoke drifts away within a few seconds and presents no lasting problem. But that is not where most serious confrontations happened. They happened inside buildings, in saloons with low ceilings and no ventilation, in hotel corridors with closed doors at either end, in the narrow spaces between buildings in a town where walls on both sides trapped air and smoke alike, in cabins and storerooms and stable interiors. In those enclosed spaces, black powder smoke transformed the tactical environment in ways that cannot be overstated. The first shot fired in any enclosed space produced a substantial cloud that partially obscured both the shooter and the target. The second shot added to that cloud. By the third and fourth exchange, participants in a real gunfight were not shooting at clear targets. They were shooting at shapes, at movement, at the location where a muzzle flash had briefly appeared, at sound, Contemporary accounts of real, documented gunfights from the era describe exactly this. Men who survived and gave testimony afterward spoke of the space filling rapidly with smoke. They described losing clear sight of their opponents. They described orienting on sounds and movement rather than clear visual targets. They described a chaotic, degraded environment where the certainty of aim was replaced by the urgency of direction. This is the real explanation for the extraordinary miss rates in frontier gunfights that have puzzled historians. It is not primarily a matter of poor marksmanship. It is a matter of the physical impossibility of accurately targeting something you cannot clearly see through a thickening cloud of burned black powder. Men in those situations were not failing to aim. They had nothing to clearly aim at. Understanding black powder smoke also illuminates something that experienced frontiermen emphasized repeatedly, and which sounds almost paradoxical when you first hear it. They consistently emphasized the tactical importance of not rushing the first shot, not because they were calm or unhurried, not because speed was unimportant, but because the first shot held advantages that no subsequent shot in that exchange would have. Before anyone fired, both men had clear visibility. The air was clean. The targets were defined. The first man to fire had the clearest possible sight picture he was going to have in that confrontation. Every shot after the first degraded visibility, the smoke his own weapon produced hung in front of his eyes, between him and the target, slightly obscuring what he needed to see. A fast shot that missed accomplished several bad things simultaneously. It wasted the only moment of clear visibility. It produced smoke in front of the shooter's own eyes, making the follow-up shot harder to aim. It produced a muzzle flash and a smoke cloud that marked the shooter's exact position for the other man, useful intelligence delivered freely while achieving nothing. A slow, controlled, accurate first shot accomplished the opposite of all of that. It used the clean air productively. It produced smoke after the round was already away, after the damage was done, rather than before. It gave the opponent nothing except the consequence of a well-placed bullet. This is why the most experienced men of the era articulated what sounds like counterintuitive advice. Take your time. Be deliberate. Do not rush. They were not being philosophical. They were describing an understanding of the real conditions in which a gunfight occurred. Conditions where the first accurate shot was worth more than 3 fast misses in every possible way. Black powder created another problem that is almost never mentioned in popular accounts of the Wild West. It left residue. Every firing of a black powder weapon deposited a thick, tarry buildup inside the barrel, the cylinder, and the mechanical action. This fouling was sticky and viscous when fresh. As it cooled and dried, it hardened into something closer to varnish. In the joints and close tolerances of a revolver's mechanism, the cylinder gap, the timing surfaces, the hand that advanced the cylinder, this buildup accumulated quickly. After approximately 20 to 30 rounds without cleaning, the fouling in the cylinder gap became thick enough to affect the rotation of the cylinder. Turning it required noticeably more force. After 50 rounds, some weapons would cease to function at all. The mechanism would simply bind, unable to advance the cylinder or cock the hammer, because every moving part was caked in hardened black powder residue. This is not a minor inconvenience in the context of frontier violence. This means that a weapon that was fired and not cleaned was a weapon that was becoming less reliable with every shot. A man who carried a dirty revolver was carrying a device that might fail to function at the worst possible moment. Serious men on the frontier spent more time cleaning their weapons than firing them. The cleaning ritual, disassembly, wiping the bore and cylinder, clearing the action, oiling the moving parts. Reassembly was not optional maintenance. It was required work, done regularly, done carefully, done because a clean revolver was the difference between a functional tool and a heavy piece of useless metal. The image of a gunfighter burning through dozens of rounds in an extended battle, never pausing, never stopping, firing and firing in the dramatic way the cinema loves. That image has a fundamental problem. By the time a real frontier revolver had been fired that many rounds without cleaning, the mechanism would be struggling badly or failing entirely. The extended gunfight, dramatic and relentless, was a cinematic convenience. In reality, weapons needed maintenance. Men who fought sustained engagements cleaned their firearms between periods of fire whenever the situation allowed, because a weapon that had been run hard without cleaning was a weapon that might fail you when everything depended on it. Now we come to something that most people have never thought about in relation to the Wild West, even people who know the history reasonably well. The loaded revolver was, in certain circumstances, a hazard to the man carrying it, not just to anyone he aimed it at. This was not a metaphorical or philosophical hazard. It was a specific, documented, mechanical reality of how those weapons were designed. The revolvers of the frontier era, the Colt Single Action Army being the most widespread, had what is called a hammer-mounted firing pin. The striker that hit the primer of the cartridge was attached directly to the hammer. When the hammer was resting in its forward position, that firing pin was in direct contact with the primer of whatever cartridge was seated in the chamber, aligned with the barrel. There was no mechanical disconnect, no spring-loaded safety mechanism keeping the firing pin from touching the primer at rest. The firing pin and the primer were simply touching. The practical consequence of this design was straightforward and sobering. If the hammer received a sufficiently sharp impact from the weapon falling and striking a hard surface, from a bump against a saddle horn, from the revolver being knocked against something in a tumble, it could fire. Not might fire, theoretically. It did fire. The documented record of accidental discharges from this exact mechanism includes incidents involving well-known figures of the era, as well as countless ordinary men recorded in military quartermaster records, law enforcement logs, and hospital accounts. Soldiers wounded by their own sidearms after falling. Lawmen whose weapons discharged when struck against a doorframe. Working men whose revolvers fell from holsters and fired on impact with the floor. This was known. It was understood. It was part of the daily reality of carrying one of these weapons. And the solution that experienced men developed was elegant in its simplicity. You did not load all 6 chambers. You loaded 5. The loading ritual was specific and deliberately careful. You loaded the first chamber, skipped the next, loaded 4 more, then lowered the hammer gently onto the empty chamber. With the hammer resting on an empty chamber, there was no primer for the firing pin to strike. A fall, an impact, a hard bump, none of it could cause a discharge, because there was nothing to discharge. 6-shot revolver, 5 rounds, 1 empty chamber under the hammer. The phrase 5 beans in the wheel was not colorful Western slang for its own sake. It was a safety procedure, a simple, reliable, learned behavior that kept men from being shot by their own sidearms. Men who understood how the weapon worked and cared about remaining alive followed it consistently and without thinking about it, because thinking about it was no longer necessary once it became habit. There was a feature on the Single Action Army called the half-cock notch. This was an intermediate position of the hammer, partway back, locked in a notch, intended as a mechanical safety. It kept the hammer slightly raised, the firing pin clear of the primer. It should have solved the problem. Experienced men largely did not trust it. The half-cocked notch was a small, delicately machined feature in a weapon that was operated under rough conditions in dusty, cold, wet environments. The notch could fail. It could be knocked out of engagement by a sharp impact. It provided a sense of security that was, in real field conditions, not entirely warranted. The empty chamber was simpler. It was completely passive. It required no mechanical part to remain in engagement, no notch to hold under stress. The chamber was empty. The firing pin had nothing to strike. The weapon couldn't fire through that chamber regardless of what happened to it. 5 beans, not 6, and the one you left out was the most important round of all. Step back and hold all of this together for a moment. Because when you put these pieces side by side, you see a picture of gunfighting on the frontier that is almost entirely different from what most people carry in their heads. A man on the frontier who might face violence on any given day began with a preference for a long gun, something longer, heavier, more powerful than a hip pistol, something that compensated for trembling hands and the degraded shooting conditions that a real confrontation produced. If he carried a revolver, he carried it in a high holster at his hip, positioned for stability on horseback and for easy access by a hand at rest, or perhaps a cross-draw, angled for the geometry of a man seated in the saddle for hours at a time. He loaded 5 rounds, not 6. The empty chamber rested under the hammer. This was not carelessness. It was the most important safety habit he had. He shot one-handed, the other hand kept carefully away from the cylinder gap where gas escaped with each firing. The body turned sideways, presenting less of itself to the threat. He did not use his sights in close quarters. He pointed the weapon, using practiced instinct rather than mechanical alignment, because under real stress the sights were nearly impossible to use and the distances were short. He did not fan the hammer. He did not shoot from the hip unless the other man was so close that nothing else was possible. He took his time with the first shot because the first shot was the only shot he would have with clean air and a clear target. He practiced drawing and handling the weapon constantly because that was what he could afford. He practiced live fire rarely because the ammunition cost him weeks of wages per 1,000 rounds. He cleaned his weapon carefully and often because black powder fouling could render it useless within a few dozen rounds, and a weapon that did not function was worse than no weapon at all. And when a real confrontation happened, when it collapsed from threat to violence in the space of a heartbeat, he faced a cloud of acrid smoke that thickened with each exchange, targets that became shadows and movement rather than clear forms, and the deep uncertainty that comes from knowing that everything he was doing had been practiced without the one element that changes everything, another armed man who was doing the same thing back at him. The men who made reputations for themselves in these confrontations were not superhuman. They were not faster than everyone else, or more accurate, or possessed of some gift that separated them from ordinary men in a clear and measurable way. What separated the men who survived from the men who did not was usually a combination of simpler things. Preparation. The habit of readiness, keeping the weapon clean and reliable, loading it correctly, maintaining the muscle memory of the draw through daily practice. Patience. The discipline not to rush when rushing would hurt more than help. Positioning. The instinct to choose ground carefully, to stand where you were harder to see and easier to act from. And experience. The hard, irreplaceable education of having been in difficult situations before and having absorbed what those situations taught. None of these things are cinematic. You cannot build a 2-minute scene around a man carefully cleaning his revolver every evening. You cannot make an audience's pulse race by showing him practicing his draw slowly and deliberately in the lamplight of a cold cabin. You cannot sell a poster with the image of a man loading 5 rounds out of 6 because of a mechanical safety concern he understands well. But those things were real. They were the actual substance of what kept men alive in a time and place where violence was a genuine possibility in daily life, and where the tools for dealing with it were expensive, imperfect, and occasionally as dangerous to the man carrying them as to anyone else. Think about the saloon. Because the saloon is the setting for almost every film gunfight, and understanding what a saloon actually was changes the way you picture everything that happened inside one. A frontier saloon was a low, dense, usually poorly lit room. The ceiling was often not much higher than a tall man's reach. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled whiskey and unwashed bodies. In winter, it was the heat from bodies and a small stove against the cold outside. In summer, it was airless and warm and close. The floor was wood or hard-packed dirt, depending on how established the town was. The bar itself was often a long plank across 2 barrels, or simple boards nailed to a rough frame. Tables were heavy, not for comfort, but because they needed to stay put when men leaned against them or used them for support. Chairs were mismatched, acquired wherever the proprietor had found them. Light came from oil lamps, 2 or 3 of them, hanging from low beams or sitting on the bar, and they created islands of yellow light surrounded by deep shadow. A man in the corner of a saloon at night was largely invisible to a man at the door. Now introduce black powder smoke into that room. One shot fired inside those walls, and you have a spreading cloud that the lamplight turns into a golden haze, obscuring the far end of the bar, blurring the shapes at the tables, filling the low ceiling with a sharp smell that bites the eyes and throat. 2 shots. The haze deepens. Men are coughing. The shapes in the far corners of the room are gone. The lamp on the bar is a diffused glow in the smoke. 3 shots. The room is a fog, movement and sound, nothing else. A man who survived a gunfight in that environment and later described it as chaotic and confusing and terrifying was not exaggerating or being modest. He was describing accurately what the inside of a saloon looked like after a few shots of black powder had been fired in it. It was not a controlled environment where skill could be clearly expressed and outcomes could be predicted. It was a degraded, smoky, dim chaos where preparation and instinct and a great deal of chance were the deciding factors. The distances deserve attention, too, because there is a persistent misconception, fed entirely by cinema, about how far apart men were when they fired at each other. The famous image of 2 men standing 30 feet apart on a wide, sunlit street, hands hovering over their holsters, facing each other in a formal contest. This happened occasionally. It was not common. The far more common reality was that confrontations happened at very close range, across a card table, in a saloon where the men had been in the same room for an hour before anything happened, in a hotel corridor where 2 men came around a corner and found each other unexpectedly, in the doorway of a livery stable, on the cramped deck of a ferry, in the close interior of a shop. At these distances, 5 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, the practical demands on marksmanship were very different from a 30-foot street confrontation. At these ranges, a man pointing his weapon in roughly the right direction had a reasonable chance of connecting, which is partly why point shooting worked. At these ranges, a miss was a significant failure rather than a slight error in aim. It also means that the smoke problem was even more acute. Two men firing at each other from 8 feet apart in an enclosed room produced smoke that immediately surrounded both of them. There was no upwind position to retreat to, no clear air just to one side. The smoke was between them and around them almost instantly. And it means that the famous advantage of the fast draw, getting the weapon out and firing before the other man, was both more important and harder to use than the film suggests. More important because at close range, a shot that landed first was devastating. Harder to use because at close range the other man was already close enough that you might not have the time or space to complete a standard draw. Men who understood this thought very carefully about positioning before anything started. They chose seats that faced doorways. They sat with their backs to walls. They maintained awareness of who was in the room and where. They positioned themselves to have the most possible time and space to react if something started. The draw was the last resort. Positioning was the strategy. There is one final dimension of this reality that brings everything else into focus, and it is perhaps the least discussed of all. Violence in the American West was not common, not in the way the films suggest. A town marshal in a small cattle town might go most of a year without drawing his weapon. A working cowboy might spend an entire career without ever pointing a revolver at another person. A farmer might go his whole life on the frontier without witnessing a real gunfight. The famous violent events, the shootings, the standoffs, the confrontations that became legends were notable partly because they were unusual. If gunfights happened on every street corner every week, they wouldn't have become famous. They became famous because they were exceptional. This context matters because it shapes how men carried and thought about their firearms. The weapon on the hip was not there because violence was expected daily. It was there because the frontier was remote and help was far away and unpredictable danger was possible. In a way, it was not in an established city. It was insurance, rarely activated, always present. The men who wore revolvers every day were not men who expected to use them every day. They were men who knew that the day they needed one and did not have it was a day they were not prepared for, so they carried, and they maintained, and they practiced the mechanics, and they hoped, most of them, that the practice would never become necessary in earnest. When it did become necessary, when the day arrived that transformed all of that preparation into an actual situation with real stakes, it was not clean, it was not elegant, it was close and smoky and chaotic and frightening, and it ended quickly, and the men who walked out of it often could not explain exactly what had happened or why they were the ones still standing. The horse plays through all of this in ways that are easy to overlook. The horse was not just transportation. The horse was the primary working tool of the frontier. A man without a good horse was a man whose mobility was severely limited, whose ability to work was compromised, and whose options in any dangerous situation were narrowed considerably. The relationship between a working man and his horse was practical in a way that is hard to appreciate in an era of automobiles and paved roads. Horses are also large, powerful, and frightened by sudden loud noises. A gunshot, especially a black powder gunshot, which was significantly louder than modern ammunition and produced a much larger flash and smoke cloud, was terrifying to horses. A horse that had not been trained to tolerate gunfire would respond to a shot by bolting, rearing, or attempting to dislodge its rider by any means available to it. A horse that bolted at a gunshot was, at that moment, no longer a tool. It was a large, frightened animal, running in whatever direction it chose, Men who spent their working lives on horseback understood this. They thought about what their horse would do if a shot was fired. They trained horses to be calmer around the sound of firearms when possible. They considered the state of their horse as one of the tactical variables in any dangerous situation. A mounted man who drew and fired a revolver risked setting off his own horse. A man whose horse bolted while he was in the middle of a confrontation was suddenly dealing with two problems at once: the immediate threat and the animal under him, doing its best to go somewhere else entirely. This is another reason why the long gun, particularly the rifle, was preferred for anticipated engagements. A rifle fired from a standing position, away from the horse and with the animal held or tied at a distance, removed the horse from the tactical equation. The problem was contained. The horse was not part of it. The hip revolver, drawn while mounted, fired in the saddle, required managing a frightened, moving animal while attempting to aim and fire a single-handed weapon. It was possible. Men did it. But it was significantly harder than any stable shooting position on the ground, and the results reflected that difficulty. We have covered a great deal of ground in this narration, and if you have been listening carefully, you have probably noticed a pattern in everything we have discussed. Every real detail of frontier gunfighting points in the same direction: toward patience, toward preparation, toward the quiet, unglamorous work of maintaining tools, developing habits, and thinking carefully about conditions before a crisis arrived. The men who handled these situations well were not primarily fast. They were primarily ready. They knew their weapon thoroughly, its feel, its weight, its tendency to pull slightly one way or another under recoil. They knew its limitations because those limitations were well documented in painful ways by men who had not known them. They had developed smooth, unhesitating handling through repetitive dry practice in the evenings when ammunition was too expensive to burn. They thought about positioning before the weapon was ever drawn. They chose the corner table with the view of the door. They noted exits. They watched men's hands when the conversation turned tense. They tried to give trouble nowhere to develop, and when it developed anyway, they tried to be the one who was already thinking clearly when it started. None of that is a myth. None of it is cinema. All of it is the quiet, careful, unglamorous reality of men trying to manage a dangerous world with imperfect tools and incomplete information. The mythology gave us the gunfighter as a figure of almost supernatural ability, the fast draw, the precise shot, the cool nerve under pressure. The reality gave us something more interesting and more human. A man with a loaded, imperfect, occasionally dangerous tool in a smoky, poorly lit room, trying very hard to do a difficult thing correctly while everything around him was wrong. That man is not a legend. He is recognizable. He is, in some ways, all of us, making do with what is available, in conditions that are never quite as controlled as we would like, hoping that preparation and patience and some measure of luck are enough to get through what is coming. That is the real story behind the gun and the smoke and the men who carried both through the American West. Not the image on the film poster, not the fast draw, the low holster, the fanning hammer, the hip shot. Those were always entertainment. They were always performance. They were the West made beautiful and clean and dramatic for an audience that wanted a story rather than a record. The record is more honest and more interesting. The record gives us men who preferred shotguns to revolvers, who carried 5 rounds in a 6-shot cylinder, who cleaned their weapons every evening like a man oils a good saddle, who practiced drawing an empty gun in the dark because they couldn't afford the ammunition to do it with a loaded one, it gives us the smoke. The heavy, hanging, acrid cloud that transformed every enclosed gunfight into something close and chaotic and poorly aimed. The cloud that explains the miss rates, explains the chaos of the documented accounts, explains why survivors often could not say exactly what had happened or in what order. It gives us the real danger, not just from the man across the room, but from the weapon in the hand, the one that could go off when it fell, the one that needed to rest on an empty chamber because the design of the firing pin made carrying it fully loaded genuinely reckless. And it gives us the economics, the 18-day box of ammunition, the dry practice, the gap between mechanical skill and live fire experience that opened up in every real confrontation and swallowed whatever confidence a man had carried into it. If you have been here for all of it, and we hope you have, because every part of it matters to the whole picture, then you now carry something that the mythology never gave you, the actual weight of what it was like to handle a firearm in the American West. Not the fantasy, not the romance, the real thing in all its imperfect, smoky, expensive, uncertain, occasionally self-injuring reality. That is the only version of history worth carrying. And here at Mystery Wild West, it is the only version we are interested in telling. If this kind of honest, careful look at the real American West is what you come here for, leave us a comment below telling us which part of this changed the way you picture it. Was it the smoke? The cost of ammunition? The empty chamber under the hammer? Something else entirely? We read those comments. They shape what we make next. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a great deal more of the real West left to uncover, and it is almost always stranger and more honest and more interesting than the version that made it onto the screen. We will see you in the next one.